Okay, well, we left off yesterday, if I recall, right here at the precipice of talking about the differences between political attitudes and political ideologies. And these terms are just thrown around a lot, and I thought I'd spend a half hour or so unpacking these for you so that you don't run into the rather embarrassing situation where you use a term or a term is used of you, and you don't understand what these things are. These things fit together nicely, and I think you'll see that as we go forward here. So let's look at political attitudes. These are the views regarding, and here's the key terms, the pace, the speed at which you want to see political change happen, and the other operative term is mode. How do you want to see it happen? So we start at the top here with radicals. Radicals seek to see revolutionary kind of change, and violence is on the table for folks of this nature. So when people say Barack Obama is a radical, you might want to look at that definition there and see whether Barack Obama is inciting violence in the American political order to bring this about. It's arguably not the case that that's not the case. And it's also the fact that one of the reasons that he is labeled a radical, if we could sort of use President Obama as an example, is that he's seen as such because of the pace at which he's bringing these things about. Obamacare and cap and trade and other measures that are in some sense altering the American political order at the speed. So there's, in a sense, I think, the piece of which people are appealing to him as a radical. But radicals in general may be inclined to violence. A liberal, in this sense of the term liberal, seeks change but more at an evolutionary pace. They seek to work within the existing system and move it toward different ends. They seek what's called progressive change, and that might be a term that sounds familiar to you in terms of politicians self-identifying themselves as progressives. So they work within the existing system, they work within the existing institutions within that system to foster change more on an evolutionary sense. Progressives, as they describe themselves today, and as the progressive movement began about 100 years ago, those were people who identified the need for a kind of change, but they weren't seeking to overthrow the current system. They were seeking to tweak and move the system in a progressive evolutionary sense toward different ends. And we'll see how this plays out with social democracy here in a bit. Conservatives don't believe that change is necessary to a large degree and are skeptical of the fact that change is good. They seek to conserve. And so a religious conservative in this sense is one who is seeking to conserve or maintain a tradition of some sort, maybe a religious tradition of morality, say. So existing institutions, according to conservatives, are key because they provide order and stability. So we don't seek to change. The last one on our list is a reactionary. These are people who seek to restore something that they thought was of a product of a bygone era, and we've drifted away from it in some sense. And reactionaries want to move back to this. So they see change as necessary, but not into something new, say like a radical. A reactionary is seeking to turn the clock back and is willing to use violence to do so. Now think about these four political attitudes in relation to the United States of America. Throw out to me who you think might be seen as a radical. What kind of groups would be seeking revolutionary type change in the American system and are willing to use violence to make this happen? Sir?
The environmental group, I mean, I was literally, they burned a Hummer dealer and
Yes.
killed. The firefighters were smart enough to get off the roof in time. This was about 3 or 4 years ago, and I literally lived 3 miles or whatever from where that was.
Okay. Good example. Yes.
Some of those groups at the One Nation rally a couple weeks ago, that was very scary.
Yeah. Right. So what do we have here? What is the status quo? We have some sense of a liberal democracy. Capitalism is involved here. A radical type group would want to be seeking revolutionary change from that. And so let's go pour acid on Hummers and do these kinds of things. Yes?
New Black Panthers.
Very possible, yeah. Very possible.
Standing there with the baton in your hand.
Very troubling, wasn't that? Very, very troubling. My eye, every time I see that video footage of those gentlemen standing there with batons, I look at the dear old gentleman in the background shuffling in to the polling place, who is himself an African American. But yeah, one more.
Well, under that definition of radical liberal, wouldn't our founding fathers be seen as radical?
It depends on, without going too far afray here, it depends on what you think the founding ideological principles of the revolution were. There are those who are saying that the founders were Lockean liberals, who were calling us to sort of freedom, equality, individualism, that kind of thing. Others say that the founding fathers were really more reactionaries in the sense that they were calling the political system back to which the British system had deviated from, and they were willing to use violence to do it. These are known as classic. Sorry?
Calling the British system back to what the Magna Carta.
Well, no, more toward those ends, but the idea that the true constitutional system of which they had played a part for 150 years of constitutional history prior to the revolution, had been corrupted, and that many people, the pamphlets of the revolutionary era, showed a lot of verbiage calling people back to the virtues of a bygone era, and that was what was a rallying call to the revolution. These are known as classic Republicans. Classic Republican synthesis is what it's called. But anyway, okay. So you see this. Liberals now are people who seek change. These would be people more or less described as progressives within society today, who seek to move the American system of government, at least in this current modern contemporary time here, seeking to move the modern system of government more toward a socialized democracy. So these are the liberals in that sense. They're also liberal in another sense, which we'll see here in a bit. Conservatives, probably not much explanation here. Those who, at least at this particular point in time, are seeking to conserve what they see as the system that the founding fathers had established, along with the free market capitalism and things of that nature. Who would be the reactionaries today? Sorry? In what sense? Huh? Yeah, that's the hard piece. I'm sorry?
I was thinking the Tea Party.
Tea Party movement. Now, yeah, but they're certainly not. They're toward a reactionary bent, aren't they? But in some sense, they're seeking to conserve, and there's a mixture of conservation and reactionary here. But I'll show you hopefully later today. I was in Phoenix and happened to just stop by a Tea Party rally that was sort of impromptu, and Sarah Palin actually showed up to this thing on given an hour's notice, and I thought, well, I can't miss this. I'm a political scientist. I got to see ground zero of politics here, and I showed up, and there wasn't a scent of, let's take up our guns and take this thing back, that kind of thing. Yeah, Jonathan.
I was just going to say, it seems like some of this kind of bleeds into each other because
What?
with conservatives,
This?
you do hear rhetoric of we do need to change things.
Yeah.
It's, it's not like they're wanting to maintain the status quo. They do want change, but they just want change in a different direction.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think the reactionaries today might be founding militias.
Yeah. Right.
Because they're the ones who are, they're loading up, they're buying, you can buy, I hear you can barely buy ammo today because there's so many people that are stocking up.
Maybe this gentleman here might speak to that issue. Yes.
Where is the place in these definitions for the person who believes that we are not where we're supposed to be, and we need to go back to where the founding fathers started us with? Because I'm certainly, I would have considered myself a conservative 20 years ago, but given these definitions,
Yeah.
reactionaries, I don't believe in
Right. The more the current administration is pushing this agenda, pushing this equation in the following way. The more these folks succeed right now, the more of these folks at least move ideologically toward reactionaries.
The problem's been incrementally happening, well, foundations for it ever since the Civil War, but most recently in the 20th century, for sure.
Sure.
And now, what we're seeing happening is built on those incremental steps that have happened in history. So now we're at, in my opinion, we're at a point where we're way off track in terms of what our government is designed to be.
Yeah.
So I would not consider myself a conservative anymore under this definition.
Yeah, we're starting to, at least notwithstanding the violence. So let me table this for 1 second here and just throw this next slide up. What's the difference between a radical and a reactionary? Well, the line there starts to blur. So if you were to see these views sort of on a spectrum, sort of on a horizontal series, you start to go, well, that doesn't sort of explain the thing. It's more circular here, isn't it? You sort of see that the dynamic here is a little bit slippery in terms of where the current political environment might be within a state. So, okay, does that give you an idea of sort of political attitudes? And these, as I mentioned yesterday, are relative to the political community you happen to find yourself in. If I find myself in North Korea today, I might find myself perhaps at least viewed in a radical sense, whether I might be beholden to using violence to overturn the North Korean regime, but I would certainly be viewed ideologically as a radical. Okay, let's move on. Now we have political ideologies, and I start with a chart to just sort of show you how these map out. And these are our four: fascism, liberalism, anarchism, and communism. And notice what they seek to balance or seek to provide some kind of solution for. We have high and low freedom, and this would be of an individual sense. So this is low individual freedom, that's high individual freedom. This equality relates to equality in a collective sense. Now, how does this kind of thinking map onto what Professor Lewis is giving us good information on? Well, this is the political question at hand here. What kind of political ideologies are offered to balance individual freedom and collective equality? How should we think about these things? That's how what Professor Lewis and I are doing here in this course is trying to balance. I'm trying to give you categories in a very real sense. He's trying to give us some theological grids so that we can think about these things in a certain theological kind of way. Okay, so briefly, and we'll walk through each one of these individually to get a sense of what they are, and some of them will be fairly self-evident for us. Liberalism. A high value on individual political and economic freedom. And within that kind of system, particularly when you combine that with a laissez-faire capitalism of some sort, you get the potential in liberal systems, liberal democracies, liberal democratic systems that are oftentimes married with, as I said, free market capitalist systems. You have the potential for greater inequality. And so we'll look at liberal democracies here in that light. But liberals usually argue that a high degree of personal freedom will actually result in the greatest amount of general collective equality. Or at least the argument is made that the bar is raised in those kinds of settings. Their argument against communist systems and more socialist systems is that if you seek collective equality as sort of the first goal that your political community seeks, you actually lower the bar for everyone. Liberals in this sense argue that the bar is raised in a setting where people are free to pursue, in somewhat of an unfettered sense, their own personal freedoms within a system of laws, of course, within a free market capitalist system, and the bar is raised. And so while it does leave the possibility that there can be some inequality between the very high and the very low, the argument is that the bar is raised much higher in terms of a standard of living. Leave it to you economists to determine whether that's in fact played out. Okay, so now we have this sense of liberalism. Then we have communism, where you have very low individual political freedom for the sake of collective equality. And of course, the common critique of Marxists and communists today, mostly residing at university campuses around the country, is that we've never really even tried this right. That in the Soviet Union and other places it didn't work because we just haven't tried it right. But high equality is the goal, and usually this involves a state that is very strong and has what's called high autonomy. It means that the state can act independently of the people within the state. Liberal democracies like the United States have very low autonomy. The government is dependent upon the people for power. And the current administration potentially is going to find out about that, say, come on Tuesday, that people have a chance to weigh in. In these kinds of settings, it's usually not the case that people can weigh in, and so the government in question has a high degree of autonomy to act. And so in these situations, particularly in a purely communist system, the government controls all facets of the economy. So political ideology, in terms of how you're trying to balance individual freedom and collective equality, is oftentimes married to an economic thought of how you do this. So if I'm in a communist system, you have the political ideology of communism married to the antithesis of an economic system that's free market capitalism in order to instantiate that ideology. Now, those two are fairly self-evident. They're sort of opposite ends of the pole. Now we get to the middle, and this is largely what we see in Western Europe today, though there are many Europeans who are loudly waving their arms across the pond and saying, do not come here. The water is not as good as it looks, particularly in Greece and France of late. But in a socialized democracy, the impetus is still on a liberal democracy, but the system is tweaked to where the government in question takes over more, and more things come under government control for the sake of trying to raise the level of collective equality. It's a movement away from more of a pure liberal democracy in an attempt to solve the glaring, according to this way of thinking, the glaring inequalities that are fostered by an ideology that pursues individual freedom to the negation of collective equality. It's an attempt to sort of balance the scales a bit. So in a pejorative sense, you hear the movement here in social democracies as a government that tries to take care of you from the womb to the tomb. And so what we'll see here in a second is the notion of a public versus private good, and then you have socialized expenditures and things of that nature. So I'll add that piece here in a sec. No? Okay. Okay. Next, fascism. We don't see a lot of fascist regimes. If we had done this course 70, 80 years ago, we would have had some real glaring examples of them. But in fascist regimes, in terms of the equation of freedom and equality, there is a low individual political freedom for the sake of the inequality, usually of a ruling class. So you don't have we're not looking for collective equality. We're not looking for individual freedom. Think about the Nazi regime or the Italian fascist. The whole political system revolved around the good of the elite ruling class, and we weren't particularly interested in collective equality or individual freedom. So in this sense, it's, at least from a liberal democratic point of view, it's the worst of both situations. White supremacist groups, I think, might be the closest we would see to sort of fascism in this country. Now, here's my personal favorite. This last one. I've always been fascinated when the big leaders of countries get together from big economic powerhouse countries get together in the G8 or these kinds of meetings, and you have people just rioting outside. And I always I'd see these things as a high school student, and I'd think, wow, just meeting. They're not doing anything particularly, radical here. They're just having meetings about business and international business of that sort. Why would these people be rioting? Well, anarchists believe that we ought to have a high focus on individual freedom, but they also think that we ought to have collective equality. And now that mixture is quite interesting. So they think what they believe, anarchists believe, is that private property does lead to inequality, but they're opposed to the idea that the state should do anything to rectify this. Why? Because they're opposed to the idea of the state in itself. This is why anarchists come and burn and pillage and all this. They believe that without the state, true freedom and equality can be attained when people cooperate freely as equal beings. Now I see a little snickers because all of you are inculcated with a certain view of the understanding of the nature of man. If you find that interesting, read Rousseau and his notion of the general will, and see if you might find that similarly humorous. So in this light, anarchist, you get the sense of them. The reason that these people show up and protest at the G8 is because we have a statism. States come in and they're trying to control people, and the state itself is the problem, and we need to free ourselves from the shackles of these states. And so you see this kind of thing. The G8 protests here. You see this kind of thing. And here's my personal favorite. Where do you buy something like that? I didn't see that. Walmart? That's possible. That's maybe there's a run on maybe anarchist, make a run on Walmart right around this time and buy up the stock of skeleton masks and things of that nature. Yeah. So I always like to get pictures for students, especially undergrads, to sort of, this is what they relate to, is they can see these kinds of things in terms of images, and they understand the nature of ideas. Now, isn't this interesting? Here's what we have, very similar pictures now, right? Between anarchists protesting in Toronto and these kinds of protests in Greece, which is by way of sort of segueing into our last thing here, that what I want to talk about is the difference between now, in light of these ideologies and these attitudes, what are the fundamental differences, and we'll go through this quick because we've covered much of this terrain now. The difference between a liberal democracy and a socialized democracy. These are people that live within a socialized democracy that are doing very similar type things, aren't they not, to anarchists? And one might want to ask why. It's likely, in this case, that this young gentleman, I believe, is protesting in light of a budget that was passed in Greece that cut back in some measure on socialized spending, and this is the reaction. I'm apt to ask my undergraduates, could this happen here? And that serves as an impetus for me to help them get acquainted with the political process, because this is Greece. And I think I've got I've got a slide here in a minute on France for you. So here's the question that's operative for us today. And this is largely, I'm gratified that this course comes at this particular point in time, because we're right on the cusp of seeing if the nation is going to step up and address this question. And what would be more interesting is that if we have a whole new batch of politicians elected to the House and the Senate who talk about this issue in terms of turning away from a socialized democracy and turning away from growing the scope and size of the federal government and having real kinds of cutbacks, are they really going to do that? So this is sort of where we find ourselves today. So by way of review then, let's see what the liberal policies are. These are the policies that are supposed to be upheld here by advocates of more of a liberalized democracy. The best state would be, in some sense, one that Ronald Reagan in his first inaugural address, if you remember these famous words, roughly the idea that the government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem. That would be a very liberal type statement to make in this sense. So this is why we have to be careful of how we use the term liberal, right? I might hear Ronald Reagan's speech in January of 1980 and say, well, that was, or 81, and say, boy, that was a really liberal speech, President Reagan. He'd say, thank you very much. And I might say the same kind of thing to President Obama here in January of 2009, and he might say thank you very much, but I might mean something very different about what it would say to be liberal in that sense. There, he would be understanding me to say liberal in terms of a progressive political attitude, that kind of thing. So hopefully you see the difference between those two now. And these should all be fairly familiar to you now. So the decision that we have before us, I think largely starting here now, in next week on Tuesday, and this might be a fulcrum upon which the country turns, is whether we're going to embrace more of this or more of this. In these socialized democracies, and you can see that healthcare falls into this realm, because it would be an attempt, at least initially, in this healthcare package, to move toward a greater equality in terms of healthcare coverage. Now, here are the operative questions that we need to consider as a society in regards to, that aspect of a socialized democracy. Is the quality of healthcare going to be the same as we have today? Is it going to be offered with the same efficiencies and at the same costs? Will it be as good? Will it simply just drag down the level of health care? Because the common assumption that oftentimes is not asked, that I believe does need to be asked in these more socialized programs, is, will the product of say a government-run something be as good as the private enterprise something? I think that's a legitimate question that we need to ask. And from our perspective, is it something that as Christians we can support? How do we think about these things biblically? Is it the role of government? I'm in this panel the other night with 4 other faculty, and the students are very much, even at Biola, very much immersed in sort of a current that in their minds being very favorable to more of a socialized democracy where social justice realms and this kind of thing. And many of the questions that the students asked us sort of showed that they were interested in our thoughts on these kinds of things. Well, one of the professors in this panel offered as an initial response that we need to be people who are less grousing about the amount of taxes that we pay. That we need to respect the fact that it's a legitimate issue of government to tax us. Now, there's a point to that, and I think he was right on that. And his point was, look, I've been to other countries where their tax systems aren't as efficient, and I had trouble going from A to B because the road system was horrible. Fair enough. And he came back to California and just marveled at being able to cruise on the 5 to get where he needed to go, and that's all well. When it came to my response, I alluded back to that and say, I don't think people in this country have a problem paying taxes to pay for an infrastructure. I think those are legitimate uses of the government, and when we get to this notion of public good here in a second, I think we'll see that it's probably better that we have an interstate highway system that the federal government has a piece of. Started back largely in the Eisenhower administration and thing. That seems to be a legitimate public good. The question that I just raised for the students is whether people aren't particularly grousing about the nature of the tax in general, but how the money is spent and in what direction, and whether it's sustainable to spend the money at the current rate that we are. And I believe we saw some graphs here the other day in that regard. And so that's more of the issue. And I think that really resounded with a lot of people. They were, oh, okay, so that was a nice distinction, I think, for them to make in their minds. So this is the question before us today that we have to consider. Yes?
As far as terms, when you describe Obama, are you using the term liberal progressive today? Or what is
Well, they're liberal progressives, but Obama even more so. Well, at least Obama is more a successful liberal progressive than Clinton. You know, the 1994 midterms were fairly notable because the country rejected the Clinton administration's tack. Well, he was largely unsuccessful at what he tried to do in the early 90s during the first 2 years of his administration. Obama's been largely successful in that regard. So while I would put them both in the liberal progressive camp, Obama's been more successful.
So is that a good term to use?
Yeah, I think so. Well, yes, it is a good term, and I think the reason, because of his success, at least legislatively, people have labeled him more of a radical than a progressive. So obviously there's a spectrum, but given his legislative success with his agenda, which is more in line with this kind of thing, people have started to use the term radical of him. Of course, of a nonviolent sense. I mean, President Obama is not advocating that we take guns to the streets to initiate and ratify health care. He went through the electoral process. But then again, when you look at the manner in which that legislation was passed, the country is collectively holding its nose on that one, and we might see a rejection of that on Tuesday. If you remember these backroom deals, which were very notable during that process. Well, for the sake of time, I won't dive too much into there, but in general, you sort of see the social democratic policies. This is most common in Europe, where you see these kinds of things taking place. A much higher, with neocorporatism, you see a much higher level of cooperation between business entities and the state. And in many cases, you see the government taking over large segments of that regard. Okay, well, here we go. Here's some more loveliness that took place in Greece, and here's some stuff in France, because we raised the retirement age 2 years. And so I think it is a reasonable question for religious and non-religious people to ask alike, is that if we head in this direction, could we ever be in a situation where you could take these things back? And if you look at this and take it seriously, the answer is not easily.
I mean, isn't the question really, do we become more of a socialized democracy? Because
we're moving in that
this is
direction.
already, no, but we're already there. I mean, we're already a blend of liberal and social. I mean, we have Social Security, Medicare.
Yeah.
We have state-run utilities. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which we've already blended the liberal and social.
Sure.
It's just a matter of, do we want to become even more so?
Yeah, the only thing that's making this current situation different than something like Social Security and things is that that's sort of at the back end of people's productive careers. Now it's looking like more that the government is going to involve itself in more of the totality. So it's likely that the accelerator is being pushed down quite a bit. But you're right. I mean, the United States has long since left a pure liberal democracy. And if you look at comparative government, particularly when you look at politics and economics, there is not too many people out there arguing that the state doesn't have some role to play in regulating an economy. I mean, that largely when you think back to Herbert Hoover, people think really bad things because they looked at the Hoover administration as a bunch of laissez-faire capitalists that were just uncaring about the suffering of the people during the Great Depression. And so that's why 1932 is such a key election, because ideologically it is ingrained in the life of the American public that the government does have a large role to play. The issues of necessity and crisis tend to foster more governmental action in that regard, as we're seeing today, as we saw in the 1930s. Okay, now a couple last concepts, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lewis. When we start talking about economies and politics, you see that the two start to have quite a bit of overlap. If a state has a certain political ideology that it's seeking to instantiate, oftentimes this plays out in its economic policies. So this is often the case that when you're trying to be politically liberal, that in some sense, in most situations, not all, you try to be economically liberal. And this is liberal in the sense of a Lockean sense, if that makes sense to you. High value of individual freedom, autonomy, in this question of balancing individual freedom and collective equality. But again, for our purposes, this is why it is just crucial for us to not just have me here, but it's crucial to have Professor Lewis and others involved in our life helping us think about these things theologically. What can we bring to bear on the nature of this issue? Jim and I were talking about the fact last night that it is not just non-religious people who have a corner on the market in terms of common sense, that there are some certain things that I think we can engage where we too can look at something and say, that just doesn't make sense. I might not be able to quote chapter and verse on a particular issue, but this just doesn't make sense. Case in point, we might look back at the Great Society, which was a legislative package offered by Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s, and look back after a 50-year history, and anyone can make an assessment, stepping back from that, religious and non-religious alike, and say, well, how's it worked out? We can read the speech, we can see what Lyndon Johnson thought was the Great Society, and ask the question, how has this worked out for it? We declared a war on poverty. Have we succeeded in that? If so, why? If not, why? These are just reasonable questions, I think, for us to ask. Now, here are three concepts that play in. Boom, boom, boom. These are the components of a political economy. The first is a market and private property. The question is the state's role in regulating and protecting these things. Does the state do this in a limited sense? Does the state do this in an expansive sense? That's the issue that we're wrestling with in today's political climate. Advocates of a more conservative political attitude in this country argue that the role of government is to preserve individualism regarding these kinds of things. Progressives are arguing that the government may take an increased role in regulating the economy. At my commencement from my institution where I did my graduate work, the commencement speaker got up and gave a rather uninspiring speech, given the fact that people were literally turning around in their chairs talking to others during her speech, which was quite rude, but nevertheless possibly warranted. But her initial foray into this area, a Georgetown professor, I believe, said something like this: well, we all know now that economies are not self-regulating. Duh. And then she proceeded to tell us why we needed more socialized democracy, and that was sort of the gist of her commencement speech. But here are the things and the components you're going to see. These three things. In terms of an economic question, there's the difference between private goods and public goods. In socialized democracies, more things are seen as public goods. Things that ought to be offered from the top down. And so now the issues that we wrestle with in this country are, well, we've largely decided that education is a public good. Is this the kind of thing that's going to be offered as a public good as well? Now, in some sense, public goods are relatively uncontroversial. Do we want different road companies competing with each other making highways? Or would it make more sense to have as a public good an interstate highway system? And as we'll see the other components here, does the tax system, can it support that? Sorry if we move through these too quickly, but these three things fit together. The more public goods you have, the higher amount of things that we consider under socialized spending. Perhaps a pejorative word that many people reject is welfare, but many people use the term welfare to describe social expenditures. And here's the kinds of things that we're now considering proper avenues for socialized expenditures: education, healthcare, transportation. And here's the key word, that social welfare, social expenditures have by their very nature a redistribution aspect to them. What should we think about that? particularly biblically. I think this is a central question that pastors need to be addressing from the pulpit. How should we be thinking about these things biblically? Should I support programs that overtly redistribute income? And many officials within the current administration have been very open about using that term. Yeah, this is what it's about. It's about redistributing income. How should we think about that? Should I support a policy like that because in some sense I see somebody who has more economically and socioeconomic higher status than I am, and I want to support a policy where the government takes from them and gives to me? Should I support that? Should I be against that? These are things I think we need to wrestle with. And then lastly, you have public goods. If you have more public goods, you're going to have more social expenditures. And then you get this. This is the question we're wrestling with in California. Governor Whitman is at least talking about taking a very different tack than Governor Whitman. Potentially Governor Whitman and potentially Governor, again, Brown are going to talk about two different very tacks on this. It's likely that if Jerry Brown wins the election next week, that taxes for the higher socioeconomic folks in California will go up. And that raises the question of whether that might drive more of those folks out of the state and the state become more at least viewed as anti-business, that kind of thing. And then you look at this. Now this chart's getting a little bit dated, but this sort of shows where the United States is. I believe this is as a percentage of GDP, yeah. Sort of see where the United States is on this. These, as you might guess, are socialized countries, and so their rates of taxation are high. I've had some very interesting conversations with students who know people who have relatives that live in these, and it's very interesting to ask about this, where their tax rates are just astronomical, but they've sort of adopted an attitude there that, yeah, the tax rate is astronomical, but it's what you guys sort of have to pay out of pocket for, we pay out of pocket up front, is sort of how they've adopted that. What's interesting when you look at this from a comparative point of view, many of the people in these countries, and I'm curious as to the measure that they're employing here, but when you look at, hey, let's poll people across different countries about levels of happiness. Many people in these kinds of countries come out really high in this regard. So I'm wondering what happiness means. Does it mean fiscal responsibility on the behalf of their country? I don't know. I mean, one might want to look into that issue. So, okay, well, yes, maybe one question and then we'll need to move on.
Seems to me, and one thing, this is anecdotal, but I think it's consistent with one thing you said, just with some other Calvin students that I've engaged with over Facebook, they really seem to be okay with that idea that the government take and give away. And to me, and what I consistently say to them is that, hey guys, this should be the role of the church and private charities, because they're violating sphere sovereignty when the federal government tries to do this, and they just can't seem to quite get that. They seem to think that it's okay if the government do it, not really thinking about what are the consequences of the government doing it.
Yeah. And well, certainly, and raising the question of whether the government could deliver the good as well. I mean, the Roman Catholics have a notion of subsidiarity, and it's the idea that the good is best delivered at the local level where there's more of a personal connection, roughly. And that's just the very opposite of government system and waste and fraud and all these things. It's just, these are things that we need to ask. We need to look at government programs now and ask how efficiently they're run, and ask the reasonable question whether healthcare and the intricacies of a healthcare would be best served by that kind of bureaucracy. One last, and we'll break here.
Just had to say something about that. I think the problem is largely because we've trained our youth and our children over the last 20 or 30 years that church is not a God or biblically ordained institution that has certain required or mandated roles. We've trained people to believe that church is optional, largely just a social network
Well, we certainly bought into the idea of sort of a self-centered society, and if a politician promises me more to meet my self-interest, it's almost amazing when I see current elections. I ran for a political office in like junior high, and I remember thinking, I know how I can get elected. I'll just promise the farm. I had no idea how I would deliver. And I got elected to this thing because I promised a soda machine on every hall and all this stuff. And people are like, I'm voting for you. And I see politicians today out there sort of doing the same kind of thing. And I think we need to ask the question, how are you going to deliver this? And would that really be good for the country? These are questions that we need to ask. Last comment. The issue that I implored these students to say is, if you're interested in generosity, the question you need to ask yourself is, who is the best purveyor of generosity? Us or a governmental entity that has bureaucracy and non-personalness to it and that kind of thing? If we really want to turn heads in this society, boy, what an opportunity for us to put our money where our mouth is in this regard. And look back at the early church and see if they didn't, in fact, sort of catch on to this same kind of thing and turn some heads. And perhaps we need to be in a position where we're willing to do that too. So, Professor, I yield the floor.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.